Saturday, August 13th, 2022, Monaco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. So today we're going to look at how the seeds of the current energy crisis in Britain were actually planted in 2008. And this report is not about how the banks collapsed and the real estate market collapsed and the Bank of England and the government had to bail everyone out and do QE. And of course, that has debased our currency, which makes energy more expensive. No, this is about something else that until yesterday I hadn't heard about. Maybe you had heard about this act that I'm going to talk about, but I heard it yesterday or the day before. I forgot exactly when, on TikTok, someone talking about it. And it's the Climate Change Act of 2008. And it was passed right around the time when everything was imploding. Northern Rock had collapsed. Lehman collapsed. We had the credit crunch. The world was going to hell in a handbasket financially. And I guess it's like Rahm Emanuel said at the time, never let a crisis go to waste. So, yeah, we're going to look at this Climate Change Act of 2008. And I've been doing quite a bit of research in the last 24 hours. And I found a very good video. And I took notes of this video, this report. And it's on a YouTube channel called Net Zero Watch. And they're part of the Global Warming Policy Forum that's chaired by Lord Lawson, also known as Nigel Lawson, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer during the Thatcher premiership back in the mid 80s to late 80s. I'm not sure if he was around. He resigned in the late 80s, I think. And this video is not to debate the climate change question. It's to show you how the policies that they've adopted, and by they, I don't mean just Labour, even though the Labour government was in power at the time, but you'll see what I mean. So I could have just played the video on my channel, but I thought it was interesting to talk to you about it, and I've taken notes, so we'll go over the notes. The title of the video is The UK Climate Change Act at 10, History's Most Expensive Virtual Signal. And this video is not from 2022. It's from way before the COVID crisis, the war in the Ukraine. It's from November 2018. So I think one of the most important points about this Climate Change Act is that it was almost passed unanimously in the Houses of Parliament or in the House of Commons. The vote was 463 to 3, so 3 MPs voted no. And I'm going to quote one of the MPs who voted no. His name is Peter Lilly. I don't think he's an MP anymore. So this is what he said about the Climate Change Act. Peter Lilly, MP at the time, one of the 3 guys, or I don't know if there are any ladies, who voted no. And I quote, "Historically, this House has made its worst mistakes, not when it is divided, but when it is virtually unanimous, not when it's adversarial, but when MPs switch off their critical faculties in a spasm of moral self-congratulation." So I think his quote there back in 2008 is proving to be very prescient. And I think he was completely right. It was a huge mistake, this Climate Change Act. So what does this Climate Change Act do? Well, it's a legally binding act that targets the UK government to cut carbon emissions by 80% by the year 2050. And at the time, of course, Gordon Brown was Prime Minister. The Climate Change Secretary, or Department of Energy and Climate Change Secretary of State, was Ed Miliband. And we've seen recently, you might have seen recently in the news, Gordon Brown is calling out for Boris Johnson to have like an emergency budget to help out the general public, an emergency budget with Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, because we can't waste any time. People are hard up. Yeah, people are falling into energy poverty. Not only energy poverty, they're falling into poverty. And you planted the seeds of that, Gordon Brown. So for you to come now and provide a solution is really interesting, I would say. And here's a couple of comments. One is from Peter Mandelson, who was in the cabinet of Gordon Brown. He's also a huge Rothschild friend. I think he's a friend of Nat Rothschild, who's the son of Lord Rothschild. He's got links to Oleg Deripaska, one of the oligarchs in Russia. He said about this Climate Change Act back in 2008, "This is a huge industrial revolution and will provide great employment opportunities." And then Prime Minister Gordon Brown said, "Let's lead the world in carbon products." So this video, this report, notes that by 2018, when it was made, there were huge costs being incurred by the Act's aggressive carbon emission targets, this 80% by 2050 carbon free. And I think the Act was going to be only 60%, but in the last minute, they raised it to 80%. So it also talks about how the UK government created subsidies to increase energy generation from renewable sources. So the Global Warming Policy Foundation also talks about the conservative estimates of the policy implemented by this Climate Change Act. And they look at the period from 2014 to 2030, and they estimated that it would cost the UK public or households £319 billion. And I would say after 2020, that's gone through the roof, this $319 billion. And the cost of this subsidy, because it's a subsidy, government subsidy to implement this policy, from 2014 to 2030 is going to go up from £327 a year per household to £875 per year per household by 2030. And I would argue it's a lot more now. Aside from the subsidies, we're getting the price increases. So according actually to Peter Lilly, he said that in Parliament, an extra £10,800 burden for each household for the period between 2014 and 2030. And the threat of rolling blackouts in the winter, that's not something that we're just talking about now or last year. This was happening already in 2018, as you'll see if you want to watch this report. Energy bills were already going through the roof. And the other thing about this Climate Change Act, according to the Department of Energy and Climate Change, I'm going to play one of their adverts where it talks about their objectives with this Climate Change Act, so you can hear it now.
Was celebrated as the world's first legislation of its kind, a legally binding target to limit CO2 emissions by 80% by 2050. This, claimed its designers, would give Britain an edge in the growing market for green technology. It would create jobs and save households and businesses from rising energy prices.
The UK stands to benefit hugely from a supply of low-carbon energy that is affordable, secure, and sustainable. It will help to prevent dangerous climate change and protect us from price volatility.
So As you can see, everything they promised, the opposite has happened. Energy has not become cheaper and more accessible to the public. It's become more expensive. And we still have the threats, of course, a huge threat of blackouts, rolling blackouts coming this winter. The other thing they talk about is that the smart grids or smart meters will be used to switch off consumers to help balance the system. So it's a form of rationing. And I remember when we moved into this house in 2015, we got contacted several times by British Gas to have a smart meter installed, and we always refused because I never trust things like that, and we already have a meter, so I didn't think we needed a smart meter, and I'm glad I didn't get one. So now you might be thinking, who's benefiting from this? Cui bono? Well, according to the Global Warming Policy Foundation, the biggest beneficiaries of this Climate Change Act have been the renewable energy companies, landowners, of course, because you have to install windmills on farms and other things. Subsidy-hungry investors looking for profits guaranteed by the government. Yeah, and it's interesting because a few weeks ago, you know that I went to Italy with my wife when we flew from here. And it was a very clear day. And I was looking down when we were going over the cliffs of Dover, or just coming onto the channel, and I could see hundreds of these windmills really blotting the landscape in the channel. That's what your money is going to. These windmills, one of the renewables. As I said, and you listened in that little advert from the Department of Energy and Climate Change, things haven't improved. And already by 2013, energy poverty had not fallen, but it had stayed the same or gotten worse. And that was one of the Labour government's goal. And it was also one of the goals of the next government, the conservative Liberal Democrat government. It was to eradicate or decrease energy poverty. So it got so bad by 2013 that they, to avoid embarrassment, apparently the Secretary of Energy and Climate Change, he had to change the way they defined energy poverty. A little bit how they're probably changing the way they define a recession. And this is, as you saw earlier, it's not about the Labour Party or the Conservatives. It's like unanimous. The whole political establishment basically is behind this. And this is what David Cameron said. He was Prime Minister under the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition. And I quote, "I want us to be the greenest government ever." So there you go. So one of their conclusions is that the Climate Change Act, rather than solving climate change, the only detectable effect it's had is create higher energy prices and increasing energy poverty. And this, as I said, was back in 2018. And we're going to come to why I think it got worse after 2020. The other negative impact it's had on the cost of living, the Climate Change Act, is that energy companies and other companies that need to use energy, they pass the cost on to the consumers. So now we're going to come to what's been happening the last 2 to 3 years. And we have to go back to October 2017, because by then energy prices were already rising. And the failure of this Climate Change Act led to politicians interfering in the price mechanism, i.e. they put price caps on energy companies. And yes, this was Prime Minister Theresa May. So you can listen to her here.
That's why next week, this government will publish a draft bill to put a price cap on energy bills, meeting our manifesto promise and bring an end to rip-off energy prices once and for all.
So, and I think this is what has made the crisis even worse, Theresa May's price cap. Because if you remember, if you were watching me last year, and I was covering this around September time, because a lot of energy companies, these challenger energy companies who were focusing on the renewables and everything, who were being subsidized by the government, they started collapsing. And why is that? Well, because with what happened to COVID, they shut down the economy. They disrupted the supply chains of all commodities, of energy. And then in 2021, they also printed trillions and trillions of dollars and pounds of funny money, so people could stay at home and not have to work and spend and not produce. And that led to a huge increase in prices of commodities. But unfortunately, these challenger energy companies, they never thought natural gas prices or oil prices could go up so much, and they didn't hedge. But they couldn't raise prices when they started going up because there was a price cap. So 31 of them collapsed from the beginning of 2021 to the beginning of this year. And what happened when they collapsed, a lot of their customers, the general public, they were passed on to the companies that survived, the bigger energy providers. But those companies that collapsed, they carried a lot of debt because they lost a lot of money, and that had to be passed on to the companies that took over them and their clients. So all that cost of bailing, well, they didn't bail them out, but taking over their liabilities and their clients is being passed on now to the customers. and you can trace this back, of course, to 2008. So I think the major lesson to learn from this is that anything that government says it's going to do, the Climate Change Act, that it's going to make energy cleaner, more affordable, more accessible for everyone, has had the opposite effect, and it has had no impact on the climate as well. 14 years later? It's a little bit like the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. And it's concerning because they've put in a lot of green agenda deals and policies in there. And this reminds me a little bit of this 2008 Climate Change Act here in the UK. So, yeah, that's what it's all about. And what's the solution? Well, the solution is not to have government involved in anything, really. Government has to be minimum. It has to basically just administer the rule of law. It can't really run things because, as we've seen here, it's wrecked the energy market in the UK, and we're going to pay for it, not just financially, but also our comfort as well, because we're probably going to be rationed. We're going to have rolling blackouts. It's going to be a nightmare. And I'm sorry to say, by voting out the Conservatives and bringing in Labour won't change anything because they're all in it together. Both parties, or even the Liberal Democrats as well, of course. So you might not agree with me. You might think if we hadn't had COVID or the war in the Ukraine, things would have been better. But look back, do a little bit of research. This was already happening in 2018, 2019. All the crises that we've seen in the last 2.5 years have done. They've exposed how ridiculous this policy is, and yes, and that politicians always get it wrong. And like Peter Lilly said when the House of Commons is almost unanimous in a decision, you can bet it's a huge mistake. So there you go. And I wish you all a great rest of the weekend. Take care. Bye.